Welcome back to Trib Live Radio, the Panther Lair Show. I am Chris Peak, and joined now by the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review's own Jerry DiPaola, covers Pitt for the Trib. And Jerry, we're going to talk about Pitt football 2014 this season, and the last thing we saw of Pitt football was spring camp. So 15 practices. I know you and I were at every one. What was one thing? I mean, was there one thing you would look at and say that was the biggest surprise? I didn't expect to see that before spring camp started.
Well, I didn't expect to see the defense come together like it did. And again, it's football in shorts, and it's hard to really tell. They don't do a whole lot of tackling, if any. But the defense, with a lot of inexperience, seems like it was coming together. I'd like to see the linebackers make more plays next season. To me, Todd Thomas, with all his athletic ability, was a little bit of a disappointment last year. Of course, his season got off to a slow start because of the situation, in camp where he was demoted right away. But with all his athleticism, you'd think he'd be in somebody's face a little bit more often than he was. But I think in spring camp, they looked like they were meshing a little bit. I think Vinopal is going to be a nice leader in that secondary. I think Anthony Gonzalez, who has good athleticism, looks like he might become a leader of that defense. He had one big play last year, the interception return against Duke. But that's the one thing. But the one thing that surprised me a little bit is a pleasant surprise. But I didn't see a whole lot of reason to be excited about this Pitt team at this point right now. I mean, the one thing that you could get excited about possibly is the schedule. I don't think the schedule is that difficult, compared to last year.
Well, I want to talk about the schedule in a second, but going back to the defense, obviously there's no Aaron Donald, and no one should expect there to be an Aaron Donald in this defense. But is there one guy that you would look at and say, if he has a good season, if he has maybe even a great season, this defense might end up being pretty good?
Dale Render, I think, could be that kind of guy. He's played a little over the past couple years, more than most of those guys have played. If he can turn into a guy who can get that kind of penetration that Aaron Donald had last year, nobody expects him to be Aaron Donald, obviously, but he's going to have to be a good player, for Pitt to be a factor in the ACC race this year. Otherwise, they could fall out of it pretty quick. KK Mosley-Smith, everybody said he had a great spring, lost a little weight, during his suspension last year. But, we don't know what he can do. I mean, he really hasn't done anything, at Pitt, since he came out of Woodland Hills, other than get suspended. But he seems like a good kid, and he seems like the kind of kid that can take up space in the middle, which is what you need from a defensive tackle. But him and Render, he and Render have to really have good seasons, because the games are decided. I think most football games are decided in the trenches, and if Pitt can develop a good defensive line, which looks like an if-you proposition right now, they could be okay.
Well, certainly in the Georgia Tech game, Aaron Donald had a dominant performance, and Pitt ended up losing the game because their offense wasn't up to the snuff. So let's look at that side of the ball. I look at it, I see really good talent at receiver, at running back, at tight end. I see an offensive line that could potentially come together, and then quarterback. Is Chad Voitek the X factor, not just for this offense, but maybe for this team this season, and how he goes is how maybe this entire schedule, this entire team might go in 2014?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's good insight because, Chad hasn't played other than the second half of the bowl game against Bowling Green, a MAC team. Let's see what he does against, the best teams in the ACC. Virginia Tech, which always has a good defense. Georgia Tech, which is always pretty good. Luckily, Pitt's in that Coastal Division, which isn't as strong as the Atlantic Division. But I think Voitek can be the kind of kid that can lead this team to nice heights. He doesn't look like the natural thrower that Tom Savage was. And of course, he's not as big as Tom Savage. His arm isn't as strong as Tom Savage. But he really puts a lot of effort in. If you ever watch him throw the ball deep downfield, he really leans back and really puts his arms and his legs and his butt into that throw. And that's because, he is a good hard-working kid, but he doesn't have the athletic ability that Tom Savage has.
So as you look at the Coastal Division, without breaking down each team, I mean, how realistic is it to think that this Pitt team could compete maybe even for the top spot in the division?
Well, they're going to have to get by Miami. I think Miami might be the best team in the division, and then maybe Virginia Tech might be also. Pitt has a chance. You know, I was just looking at the schedule. I was talking to our good friend Joe Starkey on the phone today, and we were talking about which game Joe might want to attend on the road, and we were thinking maybe Virginia. Trip down to Charlottesville. Pitt could be 4-1 going into that game. You know, if Pitt takes a 4-1 record, they open up, against Delaware. Then it's Boston College on the road. Akron's in there. Florida International's in there. And one other one, Iowa. Iowa at home would be the tough game. But if they can take a 4-1 or heaven forbid a 5-0 record into Virginia in mid-October, there could be a lot of excitement around this Pitt team, and it's possible because of the schedule. The schedule isn't that difficult, isn't that challenging. But like you said, the quarterback has to be the one that maybe a caretaker might be a good description for Wojtek this year because he has a nice receiver. I think you're going to see a lot out of Manessa Garner, at the other wide receiver position, wide receiver / tight end. He's built more like a tight end than a wide receiver, but he's probably going to play wide receiver. And then James Conner. If Conner can come back from that knee injury, and all indications are he will, at least that's what we've been told, maybe the offense might be okay. But can the offensive line come through? A lot of question marks on the offensive line with Rothrow looks like he might. Rothrow might be the one kid that could get drafted off that offensive line next year. But T.J. Clemmings has to make big improvements. Artie Rao, looks like a good, smart kid. Good kid with a good quote and knows a little bit about the situation. But can he be a dominant offensive lineman you're going to need to keep those defensive lines in check? The ACC defensive lines in check. What about Dorian Johnson? Highly recruited, 5-star recruit. Didn't look like it last year. Even though he's a freshman. He's a freshman.
Right.
Hate to be critical, and he was up against, a pretty good pass rusher in Jeremiah Tachu, who got drafted, fairly high this year.
Yeah.
So, you can't be too hard on the kid, but the offensive line needs to come together in order, for everybody else, other parts to work.
It's Jerry DiPaola from the Pittsburgh Tribune Review joining us on the Panther Lair Show on Trib Live Radio.